we are in week 1, part 3, and this lesson we're going to cover an overview of the entire Bible. These week's videos are meant to just simply introduce the Bible, so over the next 10 minutes I'm going to try to cover the entire thing. We'll go slow over the next 5 weeks. Now I'm going to add this part to the comments in the video, but here are 10 important Old Testament dates that everyone should know. Circa 1950, the time of the patriarchs. Either 1446 or circa 1250, that's the date of the Exodus. It kind of depends on whether or not you decide old dating or young dating for the Exodus. Circa 1200 is the conquest of Canaan. That's when the Israelites enter the Promised Land. Circa 1000 is when David becomes king. Now this is when we can start getting really accurate numbers. 922 is when the kingdom splits between Israel in the north and Judah to the south. 722 is when the northern kingdom is destroyed because the Assyrians attack them. In 622, it's the discovery of the scroll, which is likely the book of Deuteronomy, and the reforms of King Josiah. 586 is the destruction of the southern kingdom, which is when the Babylonians come in and they take God's people into captivity, and that's when you get several of the popular stories like Daniel in the lion's den. 522 is the return of the exiles. They actually get to go back to the Promised Land. They restore the temple, the rebuilding of the city and the wall begins, and then circa 400 is when the prophet Malachi begins prophesying. He's the last one in the Old Testament, and then about 400 years after him is when the time period of the New Testament and Jesus, the Christ, starts. Now, the Old Testament is much more spread out, as you can see. It covers around 1,500 years, not counting the time before the patriarchs, which we'll talk about in another lesson on how we can date those possibly. The first 30 years of AD or CE are Jesus' life, and then either in 30 or 33 Jesus dies. He's buried, he comes back to life through the resurrection. Over the next 2 decades, the church grows, and starting around year 50, people start writing down everything that has happened, what is happening. They start writing down pieces of advice to other churches, to encourage one another perhaps, and these letters are the books of the New Testament, the things people will start writing down when they realize that they should do so. By either 69 or 95, depending which scholar you listen to, the books of the Bible are done being written. 95 is the late dating of conservative datings for the book of Revelation. And so the New Testament is done within 100 years. So the Old Testament, 1,500 years. New Testament, 100 years. But that makes sense that the Old Testament would take longer than the New Testament to be written because the Old Testament sets the stage. It's the creation of the world until the Messiah comes. The New Testament is the Messiah's come, now what? And that's what here. So the New Testament says, it's here, it's happened. The Old Testament is, so what do we do now? Oh, I guess we'll do this. And then more and more slowly revealed. The New Testament is, it's here. So here's the quick overview of the entire Bible. Without really telling you what happened, I just gave you the dates of everything. Here's the 6-ish minute version of what happens for the rest of the Bible. It starts in the beginning, obviously. God created a universe. He makes all things good. But creation is no longer good. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. So what happened? Well, sin, when someone disobeys through either action or inaction, when they disobey God's ideal ways of living on this earth, that's called sin. And shortly after the first people, Adam and Eve, commit the first sin, God starts working on a way to repair his broken creation. We'll cover those first ways in the first few lessons that are going to come up soon, but it's not long until the story of the Bible that we learn, that humanity is doomed to fall on its own. It results in so much failure on its own that God resets everything with the flood. But we kind of had to have that first circumstance to know that humans can't cut it on our own. When we've separated ourselves from God, we are going to be separated from goodness. And so there was no chance, and God reset with a flood. Now, in order to intervene and start saving his creation, then God lets humanity repopulate, and then he picks a man that we often call Father Abraham. Father Abraham is the man picked to create a new nation that's going to be God's way of working to save the world. It's important to note, I think, that God did not pick a nation and say, you know what, this nation over here, I like them, I'm going to bless them. He actually said, no nation is good. I'm going to pick a man who has no inheritance whatsoever, and I'm going to bless him and make a new nation out of him. He didn't just pick people willy-nilly. He started from scratch in order to start something new. And so Abraham becomes the father of the nation that God will use to teach the world about God. There's a problem with this plan, though. Other nations have already formed. God let the world repopulate for a while, and there's this wanderer without property. It seems like he's actually a pretty wealthy guy, but he's going to find it hard, though, to gain the ear of all of the nations when he's just one guy, and it wasn't until he was actually pretty old to start having a family. And so, through the story of Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, or the Coat of Many Colors, a group of Abraham's descendants, those who are born from Abraham's lineage, specifically the group of people who are the children of the man named Israel, who's one of the descendants of Abraham. That's why they're called the Israelites. So all of the Israelites move to Egypt. That gets us to the end of the book of Genesis. Now, 400 years pass between the end of the book of Genesis and the beginning of the book of Exodus, and in that time period, the Israelites do become the size of a nation, but they aren't yet an independent nation because they grow under the shadow of Egypt. During this time, also, Egypt decides it wants to keep the Israelites as slaves. Unfortunately, that happens, but we get the story of the Exodus, where God makes a name for himself. Not only does he literally reveal his name to the Israelites for the first time, but also God makes a name for himself throughout all of the nations because of how powerful he is, and he shuts down the world's greatest superpower of Egypt. Now, God's good creation that was cursed by its own doing, that we know that can't save itself, it now has a nation set free from Exodus, or from Egypt, that is going to be humanity's chance to be redeemed. God's plan for redemption is now ready to be put into place, though, and so it's not ready to be put in place, and because the time is not right, as we'll talk about later on in our lessons. And so sort of a temporary method is created instead. Before Christ, God instituted a sacrificial system that looked forward to true redemption. Just like we, when we look to Christ, we look backward to our day of redemption. So the Israelites looked forward to that day. But debts can't go unpaid, and so there was a temporary sacrificial system put in place to push those debts forward to the day that they looked forward to redemption. And so the second half of the book of Exodus, also the book of Leviticus, the book of Numbers, the book of Deuteronomy, those explain that sacrificial system and the law system, the morality code that the Israelites were to have. That's called the Torah. Also included in those books, though, is how the Israelites get into this piece of land on which they are to live. And God puts his people in the middle, actually, of the major trade routes of that day, which is a great place to be for a nation who's supposed to tell the world about God and how he's going to save humanity. So now the stage has been set for the Messiah to come, except one little problem. The Israelites are humans too, and humans are really, really good at sinning. And so, starting after the book of Joshua, the Israelites fall into this cycle, this four-part cycle, that just goes over time and time and time and time and time again, and they just get more and more creative at going through this cycle. And the cycle is sin, supplication, servitude, salvation. Sin, servitude, supplication, salvation. I gotta get those right. So sin is that people forget about God and they start sinning. Then they go into servitude. Often it's literally slavery. And God lets people have their way, so he pulls back his blessings. If God pulls back his blessings, then now comes the world and all of its evil. They realize they've sinned now, so sin, they get punished for it, and now they call out to God. It's supplication. A prayer of supplication is calling out for help. So they ask God for help. They realize they don't ask for forgiveness. And then God, because they are his nation that he's promised he's going to work through, he brings them salvation of some sort. Often it's through the Judges or things like that. Judges is the best book to look at this four-part cycle, but it continues on throughout all of Old Testament history, throughout the whole Old Testament. And it goes to show that even though God was willing to impart righteousness for faith and provide a code for his people to live well, and even create a sacrificial system for covering up sins until the time of ultimate redemption, humanity still doesn't cut it on its own. A recurring phrase in the book of Judges is that in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. But even after you get into 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and even the stories of Samuel and their kings, you learn that people still don't have the king that truly matters, and that is the king of God. God was meant to be their king. People are always unwilling to draw near to God like they should. So, sin, servitude, supplication, salvation, time and time again, throughout it getting worse and worse and worse. Now, at one point, even God's nation splits into two people, so there's 10 tribes to the north, 2 tribes to the south, but we'll talk about that later. Through it all, though, there's always a prophet addressing God's people, imploring them to draw near to God and make him their true king. It's the books Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and I might have skipped some of them, but all of those are prophets calling out to the people of God saying, don't give up on God. Or some of them are saying, you did give up on God. And that brings us eventually to the New Testament time period, because the prophets are always calling out to the people, but eventually we get to the fullness of time. And the fullness of time is interesting. We'll talk about that later. That's what the Bible describes the time period of when the Messiah was able to come. I think what's neat about it is people finally have a way of communicating across almost the entire known world in a moderately safe manner. But now we're in the time period of the New Testament. We get the Gospels, which explain the birth and the life and the miracles and the teaching and the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. You get the book of Acts, which is the birth and spread of the church, the first days of the church, the persecution that happens. Paul, his conversion, and then he starts on his missionary trips. Then you get to the epistles, and the epistles are when the letters are written to the various churches to explain what they were getting right and wrong about believing in Jesus or encouraging them. Included in the epistles, and the way the Bible sorts them, is you've got the Pauline epistles and all the other ones. One of the epistles, which we'll spend a whole independent lesson on this one, is the book of Revelation here. And so that is the general overview of the Bible. I just said a whole lot, and I know I went over the 10 minutes. But please, if you'd like to comment at all, please do. We will hopefully slow down a little bit in the next lessons. Thank you.